Hi, and welcome to another AMACO workshop. Today we're going to talk about super simple silk screens. If you've ever wanted a silk screen in the past but thought, ooh, I don't know about all that those steps and that equipment, we have made it easy for you, and we're going to show you how to make simple silk screens with common materials that you can use in your classroom, affordable for all ages, and show you how you can use them to print on clay. So let's go. These are the materials you're going to need. You're going to need an ironing mat. You're going to need heat transfer vinyl. You're going to need velvet underglaze. Remember, you make that, the ink, you just let the underglaze dry out and it'll turn to printing ink. You need organza, painter's tape, a Sharpie marker. You'll also need scissors and/or an X-Acto knife, some sponges, an iron, and last but not least, parchment paper, the kind that you use on cookie sheets when you're baking. You'll also need some clay. We're going to use AMACO number 25M. It's a great white earthenware. You're going to need a scraper, a room key, a gift card, something that you can use to smooth out the clay before you print. You're going to need soft paint brushes. You'll also need, of course, your underglaze, velvet underglaze. Remember, you have to make your own underglaze ink. You just pour it in a shallow container, let it evaporate. It's so easy, and it's ready to use just as a printing ink. And you'll need Teacher's Palette Light. It's a translucent glaze with a little bit of color. Works beautifully over a printed surface on clay. The first thing that you're going to need to do is you're going to need to draw and cut your stencil. So you take your heat transfer vinyl. It has two sides. There's basically two sheets that are kind of sealed together. There is the transfer, the heat transfer that goes on the material, and there's a plastic acrylic sheet that's bonded to it that holds everything together. Shiny side down on this matte side, you're going to draw out what you want to silk screen. Draw shapes, remember, not lines, so you can color it in. Anywhere that you color in is going to print. And this is what makes it so easy, because sometimes when you do silk screen, you're like, what's going to print and what's not. This is easier for students because anything that's colored in will print. So shiny side down, matte side up, Sharpie marker. Then once you've drawn your shapes, take an X-Acto knife and you're going to cut off that first layer. That's the transfer that actually goes onto the cloth. You're removing that, and you're going to have an acrylic sheet that's left. So you're only cutting through one of the two sheets. Sounds kind of tricky, but really it's not, because that clear sheet that holds everything together is pretty thick and really hard to cut. So it's really not that hard. You can overcut a little bit at the corners so that you can get the pieces off easily. Just take your time. It's not difficult. You want to do as best a cut as you can, but I love that hand cut look. And you can also put a sheet of colored paper up under it to show exactly where it's going to print. Take your organza, sandwich it between your parchment paper, and iron it so it's good and flat before you apply your stencil. Put your stencil onto your fabric with the matte side down where you drew and the shiny side up. That way you're going to seal the transfer, that vinyl, to the fabric. So again, all you have to remember is shiny side up, matte side down, dry, hot, iron. Dry, hot, iron. And don't iron it like you would clothes. You want to put it on and really push it down to get it to seal, because you want to be able to remove that plastic sheet like I just did and then give it a second ironing. Trim off your excess fabric, and then you can trim right to the vinyl or not, and then take some tape. I'm using painter's tape. You can use probably whatever tape you have handy, and you want to tape around the edges. This keeps it from curling and flopping around when you're trying to print with it, and it's almost like the frame around a silk screen. Very low tech, works great. So you just trim off the excess and then you're ready to print. if you work with younger kids and you don't want to use an X-Acto knife or you want to do a more low-tech method, try this. Take your stencil, the heat-sensitive stencil material, and cut it into shapes. Take your material and just lay them on your material, shiny side up, and make the arrangement of what it is you want to print. Now you have to remember, the shapes you're adding are the places it will not print. It's really not a big deal. It's a little bit of thinking backwards, but I found the prints work just great without overthinking it. So you're going to place them everywhere you want to put them. This is a good time to talk about design principles. It's a good time to move things around till you get what you want. Once you do, you put the parchment paper over, hot, dry iron, really press. And don't move the iron a lot to shift the parts, but you really have to press, and the iron does have to be hot. So you have to be careful. Then you're going to peel off the little pieces. They usually come off pretty easy, but just in case maybe some didn't stick so well, don't worry because you can re-iron it again or add another piece. So I always do a second ironing to make sure everything's kind of really locked in place. Again, try not to shift the iron around, really just move it and press, move it and press. No steam, hot iron. Now you're ready to tape it off, but sometimes when I do these and I tape it, I find I have these big areas that I don't want to print that big blank area. So it's a good time to cut your shapes or look at your scraps, where always the good stuff is, and put those on and add some extra shapes after you've already taped around your screen. Now you have two great screens and you're ready to print. Sometimes this is what I do in my own studio. I have a die cut machine and I load images, or sometimes I draw my own image and load it into the software. It's a little more complex. And frankly, I would never, nor did I ever when I taught, use prefab stencils with students, because I think this kind of commercial kind of thing instead of a hand cut stencil kind of is not as good as what they will do. And I think it sets not a great precedent. So I don't really use these in the classroom. I do use them on my own work, and I've drawn and made my own this way. Now we're ready to print. We have a smooth slab, so make sure it's a moist, smooth slab. Take your stencils and put it stencil side down. If you get confused and you do it the other way, it's really not a problem, but it's really best to put it kind of grabs onto the clay. You'll notice I rubbed it down. Again, I'm working on a moist slab because I like printing flat. And then once I'm done, I like to make my piece. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a minute. I start with my lightest colors, and I like to mix my underglazes so I get this wide value range. So I go with my lightest colors first, I overlap, I keep mixing the colors. This is a great way for kids to mix colors without contaminating all your colors in the classroom, so you don't end up with a lot of mystery mix at the end of the day. So they can go in, feel free to overlap, works great. It really doesn't smear because the underglaze is more of a paste form. If you take 16 ounces of an underglaze and put it in a pie pan to evaporate, you will end up with 8 ounces of printing ink. Doesn't sound like much, but man, it goes a long way because you don't use very much. Now we're going to try our other screen with a little chartreuse and a little blue-green, a dark color. So I'm going to start by just I'm going to mix them together. So I'm going to put it face down, stencil side down. You'll notice once I get it where I want it, I press it into place so it doesn't shift. Again, the slab is moist. And I can mix the colors right on the screen. I love that because I don't like pre-mixing the colors always. And it gives me a great look. So it ends up with this kind of dark blue-green. So why not talk about analogous colors now and put a little blue on there? You don't have to clean the screen out. I love that. You just print, just keep on printing and turn the screen and overlap. And by overlapping and turning it different directions, you get some really great effects when you're printing. Now let's make a template. From where? From our coffee cup, of course. So now what you're going to do is you're just going to cut the bottom off, and this is going to end up being your template. So hang on to the bottom, you may use it or not. Then cut up the seam, and all you have to do is flatten it out. You can use this exactly as the template or have your students trace it so you have multiples if you want to. Now we're ready to make our cup. We have a slab that's as big as our coffee cup template. We've smoothed it out. It's moist. I just rolled it. Now I'm going to use both screens. And you'll notice that when I'm printing with this first one, I use a lighter green, and I was afraid it wouldn't show, so I put more of the dark green in it. And I love the way they combine. I even come back to the light green to highlight a little bit more. I'm going to use some turquoise, some white, and some blue-green, and I'm going to mix these, and I can mix them on my little palette, or I can mix them right on the screen. And right on the screen really works just as well. It's very low tech. You don't need to have another surface to mix things up, and it works really good. Again, I'm starting with lighter to darker. I'm overlapping my prints. I love printing flat with these overlaps and just put my pattern everywhere and then cut to make my project. So I'm going to make sure that I've printed all over the surface. And now I'm going to cover that surface with a piece of saran wrap. I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to smooth it so the inside of my cup is smooth too. And I'm going to put another piece of saran wrap on it so I've sandwiched the clay in it. Because now I can turn it over, put my template on top of the saran wrap, use a Sharpie marker, and I can trace it. And if I don't push hard, it doesn't make a mark at all. And I'm going to add a little extra on the side so I can overlap the cup when I go to construct it. And instead of using a common pottery cutter, I'm going to use my scissors. I love cutting slabs like this. And I'm going to cut it out, and then I am ready to go. Instead of cutting a 45-degree angle, I'm going to press it with my fingers. And then once I've done that, when I go to score, I just peel back the plastic a little bit, enough so I can score. And I'm going to score both sides. I'm going to add a little bit of slip, and then I'm going to put the sides together. The good thing with doing the plastic on this is that it kind of holds the form together. You'll notice in a minute I let go of it and the shape just stays. Also, if kids have to go to another class and you have to return to that project later, this is a great way to keep it moist from one day to the next. You still have to additionally cover it to make sure. Now, we're going to seal the seam, clean it up with a wet paintbrush, and make sure everything's well attached. Remove the plastic from the interior. Now we're ready to build the base. I don't always get rid of this seam completely because I really like the look of the maker and I love that seam, but you can get rid of it if you choose to. You can take the plastic off now or later. Now I'm going to do the bottom, but I realized that that bottom is a little smaller than my actual cup. So I'm going to trace around my cup, and I'm going to go in here and I'm going to cut it a little bigger. This only fits one way, so I would suggest you mark it so you can get that bottom back on the cup going in the right direction. So just know which way you're going. I'm going to peel both sides of the plastic off, set the cup on, and I realize the slab's just a little too big, so I'm going to go in here and trim it again. I want it no bigger than 1/4 inch all the way around. I want a little bit to overlap, but I don't want a big bunch of clay. I'm going to clean the edge, score the bottom of the cup, and score that little slab, and I'm going to add a little bit of slip, score it again, and then turn it onto the base and really press it into place. Then I can take a moist paintbrush, wet paintbrush, and clean the inside. I don't add a coil on the inside, you can. Now I'm going to clean the outside, and then once I've done that, I'm going to take a paddle and I'm basically going to paddle that little bit of clay I left up onto the sides. This really helps it to attach, gives you a nice finish. And if you don't have a paddle, or if you don't want to paddle it, you can also do it this way by just rolling it on the table. And your hands on the inside, you're really not messing with the outside too much. Again, I do a lot of cleanup with a wet paintbrush. And now, wow, look at my cup. It looks good. And you can leave the plastic on as long as you want to if you're worried about messing up the surface. But you know, I took it off fairly early on when I did this, and I tried not to overhandle the exterior. But if you're worried about students doing it, or you know, it messing up, leave the plastic on a little bit longer throughout the process and just peel it back where you need to. Now let's talk about how to glaze it. I suggest two kinds of glaze. There's Teacher's Palette and there's Teacher's Palette Light. This is the difference between the two. Teacher's Palette is very opaque. You have to think about it like acrylic on an acrylic painting. It's solid. And what I love about the Teacher's Palette is the colors mix like paint. So if I mixed a red and a yellow, I get an orange. They're beautiful. They're very opaque. I suggest doing 3 coats. Very, very solid. On the exterior, I put Teacher's Palette Light. It's the same glaze family, so they work really well together. And Teacher's Palette Light is a translucent glaze that has a little bit of color. If you want it even more transparent, sometimes what I do is I mix it 50-50, I just eyeball it, with an AMACO Clear F10 or LG10. And that still gives it some color, but it's a little bit more transparent. I only use 1 coat of Teacher's Palette Light, makes it way affordable. It's good for 2 things, texture and really good over underglaze, and it's great for small kids because the more they slap on and the more it overlaps, the more beautiful it is. This is our slab that we printed, and we put Teacher's Palette Light Aquamarine over the flowers and overlapped some peridot, which is a chartreuse, in between. Again, when you use Teacher's Palette Light, you want to overlap the colors. They work really well. You don't have to worry about painting them side by side like some glazes, and that's hard for kids. So you just overlap them where they come together, or just overlap them anywhere, and they work great. On this tile, what I did is I underglaze printed. Well, first I put orange everywhere. And you'll notice it has a little bit of texture in that orange background because I used a small paint roller, or sometimes I use a sponge. I never use a brush because kids can't remember whether they've added 3 coats or not. And if they don't, and the final product after it's been glazed, it's streaky and sometimes not so pretty. So what I did is I got rid of my paint brushes and only had students sponge it on. I found I went through less product because the colors are very strong and intense, and really they could just use 1 coat. And they ended up, if they didn't get enough on, it looked great in the end. So in the bottom middle, that's after it's been bisqued with no glaze. Right above it has a clear glaze on it. So you can see how the colors really intensify once you put a clear glaze. On the left side, I covered that entire side with Teacher's Palette Light Zircon. It's a blue. Now I'm working in complements, but it really worked out great. And on the right, I used fire opal over the whole thing. So you can see how it changes things quite a bit, like the orange with that fire opal over it really intensifies that orange. Don't be afraid to mix your colors because I'm telling you, any combination you use with Teacher's Palette Light will give you some great results. I hope you've enjoyed our workshop today. And if you would like more information, if you go to YouTube and look up AMACO Brent, there are a ton of videos that we've posted on all these techniques, including how to make the ink and other printmaking methods. Also, if you go to amaco.com and look on the site, there are a ton of lesson plans that we've posted. Lots and lots of information. Get in there, look around. I know you'll find something you can use in your classroom. So long.